I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library, which is a program of Jewish Learning Works. And I'm very appreciative of your being here for this program with Stephen Mills in conversation with David Waksberg. I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library, who are our largest source of support and make what we do possible. I hope you'll consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And I want to thank our co-presenter, Shalom Bayit, which is the Bay Area's Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Response within the Jewish community. And they do extraordinary work, and we appreciate their partnership. Before we begin, some quick technical notes. Automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Everybody but the presenters will be muted, but after the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and you can feel free to put whatever questions you have in the chat, and I'll relay them time permitting. It's a special privilege for me to have Stephen Mills with us, as I feel enormous gratitude to him for having written Chosen, which is a book that affected me deeply. He's the author of Next of Kin, My Conversations with Chimpanzees, which was a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year. He has advised and written for many public interest organizations in the fields of human rights, civil liberties, and the environment, and has worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council for nearly 40 years. He serves as an ambassador for Child USA, which is a nonprofit think tank fighting for the civil rights of children. He will be joined in conversation by David Waksberg, who served as CEO of Jewish Learning Works from 2007 to 2020, and had previously played a leading role in the movement to rescue Jews in the Soviet Union. Among the many things I appreciate about David are his efforts as a leader to encourage Jewish communal institutions in the Bay Area to address the issue of child sexual abuse in a meaningful way. David, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Howard, and thanks to you and to the library for hosting this really important conversation. I'm thankful to all of the people who are here with us, and I'm really happy to see so many faces that I know and haven't seen for some time. Before I begin with my questions for Stephen, I have to just make a comment. About 6 years ago, we, a consortium of organizations convened a conference in the Bay Area called Beyond Silence to focus attention and to do something about this very issue. And in preparing for this conversation, I went back and went over, reviewed some of my notes and files from that conference. And it actually really saddened me because we felt it was such a great success at the moment, and that we had made such progress, that after reading Stephen's book and after my conversations with him, I see that we didn't make the kind of progress that I thought that we had made. And it brought up for me the question that I've often had to confront, which is, are we really making a difference versus are we just trying to make ourselves feel good? And I'm hopeful that as we go through this conversation, we'll be moving toward the former and not the latter. So my conversation with Stephen will roughly follow the structure of his book, which begins with his personal story as a child, the abuse, the trauma, and the post-traumatic effects of that abuse. And then finally, his efforts to protect other children and bring the predator and his enabler to account. And at that point, the lens broadens and the conversation becomes a little more about our community and thus about our responsibilities. As we go, if you have questions, if our conversation provokes questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. My hope is to open it up with sufficient time so that many of your questions will be addressed. I'm going to be asking Stephen questions for around half the time, and then Howard is going to moderate your questions from the chat thereafter. So I'll begin. First of all, Stephen, thank you for writing this book. It was itself an act of courage, I think. For those, and I think it's probably most of the group here who have not read the book, please give us a brief overview of your story.
Sure. And first, I want to say thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. There aren't that many Jewish venues having these types of conversations, which is telling in and of itself. So I want to really acknowledge the courage it takes for the Jewish Community Library and Learning Works to host this. And I want to say I've actually the last couple of weeks been speaking at several Jewish venues and a couple of synagogues, one in Toronto, the first time this discussion has happened at a synagogue in Toronto, and then at Congregation Beth Elohim in Brooklyn, which is the first time to my knowledge this issue has been aired in that way, at least in a Reform synagogue in that context. And, you know, one thing, there are a few others in addition to those two, and one thing that strikes me that I just want to share off the top is that I've been kind of astounded at, before speaking to largely Jewish audiences, folks telling me right up front that many members of our community don't think that's a problem here. You know, sexual abuse is not a Jewish problem. My friend Lori Weinstein, who is the ex-head of Jewish Women International, is fond of saying that we Jews are great at othering. You know, that's like someone else's problem. That's those people over there. You know, they're the ones with domestic violence. They're the ones with child sexual abuse. So I just like off the bat like to familiarize you with the latest stats from NIH that the rate of child sex abuse is exactly the same in the Jewish community as in the population at large. It's also within the Jewish community consistent across all denominations, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. So if you're one of those who think it's not a problem on our community, or you're thinking, well, I don't know people who have been sexually abused in our community, trust me, you do. They just haven't shared it with you. And in my experience, what's special about we Jews is not lower rates of child sexual abuse, but our inability to talk about it. And that's a whole separate discussion, but I just want to mention it because this sense of shame, of shanda, is very deep. And there's lots of reasons for it. Partly the fear of airing our dirty laundry publicly after 2,000 years of exile and fear of, you know, civil authorities is a really strong force in our community, in all our communities. And we all carry that heritage with us. So, you know, that's just to say this is a serious ongoing problem in all of our Jewish communities. And second thing I just wanted to flag is that this is really a tough topic to talk about. And so if this is, if it does resonate with things that happened in your own childhood or adult life, you know, I just urge you to take the time to be good to yourself. I haven't had an event yet with Jewish audiences where someone or ones afterward came up to me in person or online and shared their own experiences. I think that's really important to have these conversations. And so please feel free, if you don't want to do that here, to contact me at my website. And I'm just going to drop my email into the chat right now. And if you want to have a private, totally confidential conversation about, you know, what this might bring up for you or your own experiences around this, either as victim or witness or whatever, please feel free. I encourage that. So with that out of the way, my what I really wanted to do with this book, first and foremost, was to convey the child's experience of sexual abuse, because I never really saw it conveyed experientially without a whole lot of commentary by the adult self. And one of the problems with conveying child sexual abuse is that we have all sorts of adult ways and adult language that we impose on it. And so it's very much a story told through who I was as a kid, which was your pretty typical 13-year-old New York Reformed Jewish kid who was just bar mitzvahed, really good in school, had a crush on a girl in my 7th grade class, was very into social justice. This was 1968, mind you, marching for civil rights, marching in solidarity with Cesar Chavez and the grape workers, raising money for kids with cerebral palsy. This is what me and my friends from Hebrew school did. And I just happened to cross paths at age 13 with a sociopath. And, most of us, again, we're used to thinking of child sex predators in the context of the church or the Boy Scouts, but sex predators in the organizational context are have patterns that are quite consistent, and that is they're con artists first and foremost. And con artists earn the trust of members of the community by knowing what it is that they yearn for, more than anything else, and then filling that void. And in the Jewish community, that was social justice. That was the Achilles heel, and still is in a lot of our communities. It doesn't mean it's a beautiful thing. It is, but that's our blind spot. So the social worker who sexually abused me, Dan Farinella, was really revered for the way that he had talked about and played to social justice and civil rights and all these issues. And in that way, he infiltrated my family, won my mother's trust, took me away to, after grooming me for one whole summer, got her permission to take me up to this summer camp in the middle of the woods, 100 miles from home, in November, where he sexually assaulted me. And I'm not going to get into the details here, except because I do encourage you to read the book, because I think it's important to share those stories very straightforwardly and in unvarnished detail, to look at how people like this operate and what it is for the kid. So I encourage you to read it. I'll just say that just the term itself, child sexual abuse, is a bit of a misnomer, because the notion of sex is very much an adult notion. The child brain, at least my brain, couldn't conceive of why a straight adult male who was married and had a son would be grabbing my genitals. It really, for me at age 13, was a break in reality. That is to say, everything in my life up until that point that I took for granted or thought I understood vanished. And there was some new reality that was utterly confusing and terrifying because of this person's physical, emotional power over me. And knowing in a very deep way my life would never be the same. It was also a near-death experience, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later, because it's really germane to the aftershocks to understand why PTSD is a lifelong affair. It's important to understand that the moment of shock, the moment of trauma, the nervous system for me, and this is the experience I hear from hundreds of other survivors, was preparing me to die. Again, I didn't think this had anything to do with sex. And in fact, my whole front brain turned off. I was in shock. And the nervous, the very, the lizard part of the brain takes over, and was convinced I was about to be killed by this person who was 2 times bigger than me and taking control of my naked body. So I had this huge rush of endorphins and left my body. That's nature's way of preparing us to die without pain. That initial shock is what reverberates forever. I say forever because, I'm 67, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's forever. In my 30s and even 40s, I was still under this delusion that, oh, I'm going to get past this. I'm going to get over this. Well, that's, you show me someone who's done that, and I'd love to meet them. The echoes may fade a bit, but the aftershocks are lifelong. And so that is what I really try to convey in that first part of the story, and that the sexual assault went on for 2 years, intermittently, of course. And then I so successfully compartmentalized the experience that it wasn't until 10 years later that I realized I hadn't been the only victim. I discovered that he had moved on to a different Jewish camp in a different state and was abusing boys there. And when I learned that, I, in one sort of lightning bolt moment, realized what had happened to me. I'd never had a word for it. I didn't have the word abuse or molestation. This is now in the 70s, and I was 23. But I suddenly got some piece of understanding about what he had done to me, what he was still doing to these other boys, and had my first encounter with the organizations that enabled him. And that's important because that's sort of that part of the story still unfolding today, 50 years later. As in almost all cases where this happens organizationally, a predator can't do what he or she does without being shielded by the people around him. And he was very much shielded by the people who were taken in, and by many people who knew what he was doing. And, we can talk more about that later, but that came as another shock to my system, that people can know and look away. And it was so shocking, and the collapse of my own denial about what had happened to me as a boy was so swift that I went into a downward spiral in my 20s. I was sort of at peak academic achievement. I was just embarking on a PhD program in economics at the University of Wisconsin. And when all this happened in the summer of 1978, and I had these revelations, I couldn't function in school anymore. I dropped out, and my behavior went off the rails. I started doing a lot of drugs, shooting drugs, committing crimes, trying to kill myself. It was almost like watching someone else's life, someone who I'd never known before. So that's sort of the journey of the second part of the book. And then in part 3, through a rather serendipitous series of events that I can say are simply dumb luck, after a complete nervous breakdown, I found my way to a psychiatrist in the early 80s in New York City. And this is before trauma was recognized. PTSD was not yet in the diagnostic manual, but he diagnosed me with shell shock. And that was the beginning of my getting help, but it would take many more years. of help and support. Decades is more accurate. But after 5 years of very intensive therapy and support from close friends who I disclosed to, and the support of my girlfriend and my wife, who really encouraged me to try to stop this guy, who by this point, this is now 1986, I was 32, so this is 20 years after the initial abuse. He had now moved on to yet another camp in another state, run by the JCC of Pittsburgh. I now knew enough and sort of had fortified myself enough that I was ready to try to stop him. And that's the third part of the book, is what happened when I did that. And, one big part of that was to find other victims, which was sort of a monumental undertaking emotionally, because it meant divulging what had happened to me to my childhood friends. And once I did that, and very quickly found other victims from the camp I went to in Connecticut, persuading them to sign statements, and to help stop this guy, which I did. I got 6 statements from victims and witnesses. This was almost unheard of in the 1980s, especially amongst men. This is much, much tougher to get boys and men to disclose, even to law enforcement. Very hard. Whole separate discussion again, but I'll just, trust me, it's very tough to get men to talk. There's just extra layers of shame and fear there. But I did, and I brought all that evidence to the FBI and the Allegheny County DA, where Farinella was employed by the JCC in Pittsburgh. And you'll need to read the book to find out the outcome. But suffice to say, there was really an awful failure, both of Jewish institutions, yet again, the latest in a chain of many of them, and law enforcement. In the epilogue of the book, I describe my decision last year to file suit under the Child Victims Act of New York, which opened a 2-year window letting victims like me sue either the perpetrators, which in my case, he died in 1993, or the institutions that enabled the perpetrator. So I filed suit against UJA Federation of New York, which owned the camp where I was abused, and the YMHA of the Bronx Riverdale, which ran the camp. And we can talk more later about their response, but my motivation in doing this was watching what was happening with other survivors and realizing that the only way to surface this issue and to change the behavior of institutions is to go to court and focus them on it, because otherwise it's the nature of these things is to avert our eyes and avert institutional attention, and the attacks on children persist.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you one more question about your personal experience, and then we're going to pull out a little bit.
Yeah.
You when you were describing it just now, you spoke about, and you write about this, I think, quite well, about sort of leaving your body.
Mm-hmm.
And my own observation was that sort of dissociation was something that you experienced for the first time during those experiences, but then later on in your life. You also you described the perpetrator, the predator, Dan Farinella, as having stolen your soul. Mm-hmm. And I've heard similar ways of survivors talking about their soul being stolen or murdered. And I wanted you to explain a little bit what you mean when you say he stole your soul, and And if that has something to do with this sort of sense of being outside of yourself. So please.
Yeah, this is something I didn't understand until my mid-30s. Because the previous 20 years, I had this sense of going through my life as if I were a zombie. And it's something I talk about quite a lot in the book. The sense that I wasn't participating in my life. I was outside it looking in, and somehow my actions were controlled by some unseen hand, by some master. Zombie, because, I watched zombie movies when I was a kid. So this was like, the metaphor that was in mind, especially in my 20s when my behavior was just completely off the rails. I mean, I was just methodically trying to disappear myself. It was so graphic. And I could not for the life of me connect the dots between that and what had happened to me. And it wasn't until my mid-30s when I was able to revisit what had happened in great detail in that experience that I came to this moment of realizing that in that series of moments that I mentioned before of this near-death experience where I was, as far as I could tell, out of my body, hovering above it, watching this scene of a man assault a boy who didn't appear to be me. It was someone else's body. In my 30s, I realized that for that entire 20 years, I'd been waiting to die. In other words, until I looked at it and re-experienced it, I was never able to allow myself fully back into my body. I'm not sure this makes any kind of sense unless you've had this kind of out-of-body experience, and many people have. But the nervous system was still on any number of levels waiting to be destroyed. And yet I went on. After that first weekend of being assaulted, I had to be back in school Monday morning, 7th grade. I had to go to English class. I had a book report due. And my body and brain functioned on that level, which is quite remarkable. I mean, we're really wired for that, for survival. We're very resilient. And, the way we accomplish that is as Bessel van der Kolk writes in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, the body holds all this stuff. If the body shared the trauma with the mind, our heads would explode. So we're able to go on and function as I did at age 13 by hiding it from ourselves. But something died. And in my experience, that was, I call it the soul, but that's just shorthand for whatever the sense of being present in one's body and life is, the life force, the sense of agency we take for granted in our daily life, and what enables us to trust and to love and to feel connected to other human beings. That was all shattered.
Yeah. Reading it, I have to confess, I'm reading these descriptions, and I want to say, Stephen, tell somebody, speak up,
Yeah.
But as you said, I think you did a very good job of bringing us into the mind of an adolescent, actually. So one other,
and I just want to add, just on that point quite quickly, it's not only, I had an FBI agent say to me because she was astounded. I had gotten statements from male victims. She said, teenage boys are tougher to crack than murderers. You try all the tricks and they just don't break. And that's who I was at age 13, 14, 15. You could have put a gun to my head and I wouldn't have told you what happened. because the terror was that deep of exposure and that this guy would kill me. And so that too persists into adulthood. And I know plenty of fellow survivors of the same abuser and of many others who are still unable to disclose, certainly publicly, but even beyond one or two very close friends.
This way, you anticipated my question, so thank you. That's exactly it. If this book were a thriller, the moment when you approach these Jewish organizations, the ones that had deployed Dan Farinella, this is sort of the part of the movie where the audience says, he's got help. Help is on the way. Everything is going to work out okay.
Yeah.
And then, oh no, they turn out to be in cahoots with the bad guy.
Right.
That's how the movie goes. And in fact, that's how the movie went.
Yes. And it's funny hearing you say that now. It's funny. I have to laugh because I'm getting, this is as sort of literary successful as this book is, Hollywood seems to have a really hard time with it because, it doesn't have that. What you're describing, of course, is the Hollywood ending. The cavalry's on the way, justice is served. There's a cathartic, the bad guy gets it. And, sorry, this is real life. And, sadly, the Jewish community, it turns out, is no different than any other. And as I said, in the 70s was the first time I got a window into that when I began talking to employees at Camp Henry Horner in Illinois, which was owned and run by the Jewish Youth Council of Chicago. The Jewish Council of Youth Services was the full name, and realized that there were plenty of senior employees at this camp who knew what he was up to. And for various reasons, out of fear of him, fear for their jobs, not wanting to rock the boat, it's so much easier to look the other way and just pretend it's not happening. And then again, 8 years later in Pittsburgh, ran into the same phenomenon. So, in the trade, we call this re-victimization. I'm now on re-victimization because here I am, 50 years later, I'm in sort of round 3 or 4, depending on how you count, with Jewish organizations. And I don't know, should I talk about that a little bit, David? Or
yes, in fact, I do want you to speak about it. I want to interject something actually from your own, Stephen wrote a piece in E-Jewish Philanthropy, and you quoted the criminologist and educator Gila Ben Shimol, who wrote, "Survivor's disclosure is a gift as well as an opportunity." So I'm sort of flipping it to the positive, but either way, where I'd like to go now is, so you had this experience of reaching out to these organizations who are very similar to organizations that many of us on this Zoom have been affiliated with, have supported, have worked for, have led, and who are ostensibly there to support these children.
Yes.
And then by extension to protect them, right?
Yes.
So the question, becomes, then what, right? Talk a little bit about that experience and specifically your takeaways. And when I read this statement, a survivor's disclosure is a gift as well as an opportunity, that's, perhaps a more positive way of looking at it, which is what is to be gained from not circling the wagons, which was the certainly experience that you had. I could speak for a long time about this issue, but I'd like to hear your perspective.
Sure. And I also want to say also, Dr. Gila Benchamal, who you met, who has said that a survivor's disclosure is a gift, knows whereof she speaks. I mean, she comes out of the Orthodox community in Toronto, became a PhD criminologist, and is, I think, the single most important advocate in the Jewish community today, both in the States and Canada. She's the person who has just been brought in by the Reform Jewish movement to run the restorative justice process there, because it was so poorly done at the outset. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the findings that were released in February by URJ, confirming what we all knew, that there were, many credible cases of child sex abuse at Jewish camps and youth activities going back decades, and acknowledging that, but not assigning accountability and not laying out a program for reform and how we're going to make it better. And after months and months and months of pushback from mostly young people in the reform movement, leadership of the URJ brought in Gila Benchamal and her partner, Alyssa Ackerman, to essentially lead a survivor-centered process. And that's really the first ray of hope we've seen there in the Jewish community. So in the Reform community. So what does Gila mean by that? It's a gift in the sense that, a survivor who discloses to an organization is really offering up the rawest, most vulnerable part of themselves or ourselves. I don't want to separate myself from this, right? So when I went to employees at Camp Henry Horner in 78, when I went to authorities and by extension the JCC of Pittsburgh in 86, when I file a claim under the Child Victims Act, which every Jewish organization supported when it was being debated in the New York State Legislature, when I file a claim against UGA and YMHA, I am really bearing my soul, and saying, this is the most painful thing that has ever happened in my life. I'm offering it up on an altar and giving you the opportunity, because that's the second part of what Gila said, the opportunity as a community to do tshuva. And so what do we mean by that? I mean, in the Jewish context, I would argue what we mean is to bear witness to the truth, to support the survivor, to undertake some kind of communal apology, and last but not least, to do better going forward, right? To correct what went wrong. I'm sorry to tell you that none of that has happened with any of these 5 organizations that employed Dan Farinella. And, that for me came as a shock. And I don't consider myself, after what I went through as a kid, to be a particularly naive person, but I can tell you, I was in survivor groups with men for a long time, many of them victims of priests in the Catholic Church. I never in a million years thought that Jewish institutions would respond as the Catholic Church did. But they are just taking pages out of the Catholic playbook. So what do I mean by that? In my claim against UJA and the YMHA of the Bronx, my claim is that there was a wealth of evidence in 1968, 69, 70 that Dan Farinella was a danger to children, and they did nothing to stop him. They have filed a motion to dismiss my case on the basis that, according to them, because some of the sexual abuse happened in Connecticut, they can't be held accountable in New York State. Well, this is classic Catholic Church lawyering. You know, this is deny and delay, deny and delay, deny and delay. And, you know, it's some black humor amongst survivors is that, you know, the strategy is to wait for the victim to die. That's the end game, you know, of this kind of lawyering. I expected better from Jewish institutions.
How, I'm sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
I'll just cut to the JCC of Pittsburgh, which is emblematic of a different approach of silencing victims. I asked them for permission to post something about my book when it was published on their camp alumni Facebook page, because that's one way I reach out to other victims. There's a lot of male victims out there of Dan Farinella walking around thinking they were the only one, not even realizing they were sexually abused, because like me, they didn't have the language for it. And when you don't have the language for it as a kid, you get locked into this mindset for the rest of your life, and it's running your life and you don't even realize it. So I asked, I had posted on other alumni pages and heard from victims at other camps. I asked the JCC at Pittsburgh for permission, and they said, no, you can't. As a follow-up to that, David mentioned an op-ed that of mine that was run by E-Jewish Philanthropy in October, and someone in Pittsburgh, a alumni of the JCC's camp, posted it on the alumni Facebook page, and the JCC took it down 10 minutes later. So, you know, they're really in the mode of we're going to shut this down, and apparently believe that that's going to make it go away. So this is, of course, very familiar to any of you who have followed these cases in other communities. And, you know, the irony is organizations that try to make it go away, it's just worse for them in the end. You know, because not only because that when the truth finally outs full force, it's that much more painful from all those years and decades of denial, but because I would argue, if you can't face what happened in the past, you are completely ill-equipped to deal with threats to children right now in schools and camps. In other words, if leadership doesn't have the courage to talk to me, and this happened 50 years ago, then who's going to have the courage to step up when a kid comes forward now, or someone has suspicions now? Forget about a kid coming forward, that's so rare. But if a parent or an employee blows the whistle, who's going to support that whistleblower and help that child? It's just not yet in the DNA of that organizational culture. And that is really, to me, what's at stake right now, is we are not protecting children yet.
Yeah, well, taking down a conversation on this topic from a Facebook page doesn't indicate an openness for someone in the future to step forward to say, well, you know, I see something that doesn't look right. It's a very different culture.
I think you also asked me, you know, what do we need to do better? I mean, should I talk about that a little? So
I do want you to talk about that. I want to hold it for the moment, because I do want to allow, we will for sure get back to that before we're done. But Howard, I see there are one or two questions there in the chat, and maybe we can go there and then come back to Stephen's point at the end.
Sure, I can just relate a couple of questions and invite people also to add their questions to the chat. Todd Silverstein asks, is a sort of point of information, did the abuser, did Dan Farinella end up in a position of power and influence in the camps that he worked in, if you could describe his position of responsibility?
Yes, he was the director of all these camps. I'm sorry if I didn't make this clear. So, you know, in addition to his power over employees, of course, the other germane piece of that is that in a summer camp context, leadership of the governing organization, the employer, you know, whether it's UJA, the Y, you know, the JCC in Pittsburgh, you know, they're really only managing one person. That's the director of the camp, right? I mean, it's not like this was a counselor or an assistant counselor or the person running the waterfront. This is the director in all these camps. He's the one person that is supposed to be overseen by the institution. So that's, you know, both crucial in terms of the intimidation factor for the employees around him, much less the campers, you know, and on the accountability side, because this is one of the fundamental obligations of institutions, you know, of any youth serving organization, is managing the person at the top of the pyramid.
Thank you. Jim Van Buskirk asks how members of your family dealt with, or whether they knew about the situation.
Yeah, so I never, and this is, again, I would encourage you to read the book, because a lot of people, survivors and families of survivors, have thanked me for really narrating that piece of the story, which took a long, long time to resolve. I disclosed to my mother and my stepfather in 1986, when I made the decision to try to stop Dan Farinella. So before I went to law enforcement, I spoke to my parents, and it came as a, I want to say a complete shock, but it became clear pretty quickly that my mother had had her suspicions and hadn't trusted them. In fact, as you'll read in the book, there were even some red flags raised inside our family, our extended family. And that was, it was devastating. You know, it was devastating, especially for her. And it took she and I many years to repair our relationship. I mean, I don't think I had really realized or appreciated how, amongst all the other wreckage in my life, how the abuse had just completely demolished my relationship with my mother. And so any kind of trust was gone. And I had felt, you know, completely abandoned and betrayed. Of course, she was conned. You know, I understood that intellectually, but really, fully being with that and getting past it and rebuilding a relationship. You know, fortunately, she had a long life and lived into her 80s, and it took that long.
Just, I want to interject something for the group. It seemed that this was a predator who was really good at identifying boys who either had lost their fathers or were fatherless in some way.
Yes, and I didn't mention, my father died just before I turned 5 of multiple sclerosis, and that's what made me a, you know, perfect mark for Farinella. Most, not all, but most of the boys had lost their fathers or had, you know, pretty troubled family situations.
Yeah, and then insinuating himself into the family, and of course,
yes, that was his MO.
From your mom's perspective, how wonderful that the director of the camp is taking such an interest in Stephen, right? So
yeah, my mother was a real, I mean, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. You know, she revered social justice and social workers. She worked in a family service agency. So in addition to me, she was the perfect mark for this guy. Again, this is not unusual. It's only the, predators cloak themselves in whatever the community is offering, right? And so the values and the language and the whatever's at hand is what they'll use. And so that was his entree in, the Reformed Jewish community, late 1960s.
Eli Raymer asks whether, your thoughts on whether one reason for the silence on the topic is a fear that going public will feed anti-Jewish sentiment in the non-Jewish world. Any thoughts on that?
I think that, that's come up lately. It's interesting you asked that, because it's come up the last couple of weeks at Jewish venues. And honestly, no, I think there's an all too human tendency to reach for excuses not to discuss this issue. And anti-Semitism is always with us. So that's a handy one. And that one's been raised every decade as far back as I can remember for why we shouldn't discuss this. So if I listened to that argument, I'd never write the book and never talk about this topic, and neither would anyone else. This came up in other contexts, by the way. Last week, someone wrote an op-ed in the foreword arguing that the movie She Said, shouldn't be released now because with all the anti-Semitism, why are we talking about Harvey Weinstein? And Rabbi Mary Zamor, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, wrote a terrific letter to the editor saying, basically, give me a break. There's always an excuse not to focus on the victims, and I totally agree. I just think it's if we can't hold our own community accountable from the inside, then, what have we come to?
Related to that, Trudy White asks what individuals can do to push or support the organizations that are involved to take responsibility and try to make amends.
Well, it's, I would say, if we're talking specifically in the context of my book, I would say, send an email or a letter to the head of the UGA New York or the YMHA of the Bronx or the JCC of Pittsburgh, and, say that you read my book or heard me talk, and you expect better of them, that you're, I've yet to speak to a Jewish audience that isn't 98% appalled by the response of Jewish institutions. So there's this big disconnect between members of the community and leadership of organizations, and I include the Union of, Reform Judaism here. And the disconnect is, or I would say the immediate cause of the disconnect is, at institutions these days, anytime an issue like this surfaces, leadership kicks it over to the lawyers. As soon as the lawyers have their hands on it, there is no moral discussion to be had. It's all about reducing liability, reducing reputational risk, reducing financial risk. And, as I said in my op-ed, the book of Isaiah is very clear in what it tells us to do. Devote yourselves to justice and aid the victim. Nothing about reducing your reputational risk. What could be simpler? Aid the victim. So that's, if you're asking me, tell these institutions to aid the victim and live out their Jewish values. More generally, I think there are very few Jewish organizations. I can only think of one offhand, Central Synagogue in New York, that has modeled the right way to go about this as of late. And that's very sobering. Very sobering.
I'm sorry, Howard, but I since we're low on time, and there are a number of really great questions in the chat, and I'm certainly willing to go longer. But since you mentioned this, could you explicate a little bit about what Central Synagogue is doing that you think is laudatory, because it could be something that others might emulate?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, a congregant came to Rabbi Andrea Buchdahl at Central and disclosed to her that a former head rabbi had abused her decades earlier. Now, the usual modus operandi here in institutions would be to try to fend her off with promises and, lead her on and just try to make it go away by pretending to do something at best, and at worst, trying to shut her down. But, Buchdahl didn't do that. She immediately launched an investigation and turned up other victims. And then, initiated a process of tshuva for the community. And really modeled what has to happen on a collective level. Because what impresses me about what she did is that the damage here is not just to the victim, the damage is collective. And I don't just mean from decades of denial. The average child sex predator has 100 or 200 victims or more, depending on which stats you look at. Back in the 80s, when I went to the FBI, the stat was 117. They were very, very specific. Now the numbers are quite a bit higher in the estimates because of reporting. So I can just tell you from my own experience, the ripple effects in the community from this are enormous. Just in my own case, there are hundreds and hundreds of families that were affected. So, what Rabbi Buchdahl grasped is that the collective healing isn't just about the victim. It's all those other people in the community that have been hiding this and not looking at it and not facing their own pain, their own guilt, and everyone carrying that to the grave. So that's what gets interrupted, and that, the willingness. So the takeaway there is this has to happen from the top down. It has to happen. It has to start with leadership and make clear that protecting children, welcoming reports and whistleblowers, supporting survivors, doing tshuva, protecting children. This is top priority.
So to simplify, sounds like what Rabbi Buchdahl did was, instead of run from it, to run towards it.
Yes, exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
That's what's demanded of leaders.
Yeah. And very quickly, I just want to add that, most, and we talked about this a little bit before the event, but, most Jewish youth serving organizations will tell you up and down the fantastic child protection measures they have in place.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, they're completely worthless unless every single person in that organization is prepared to enforce them. And I won't go into it. We don't have time, but we've seen way too many examples this year of where Jewish organizations with solid protocols nailed to their bulletin board failed miserably when the event itself happened. So that this is a real lesson in human behavior, right? That it's not enough to have something in writing. You really have to change the culture of a place to be responsive. And that's why it has to start at the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone, Barbara Wilson, actually just posted, what about an ombudsman or some sort of whistleblower structure?
I think at large enough organizations, some of these are too small for that, but I think it's
or in a community as a whole. Right, if the community says, you know, if this happens at any of these institutions, camps, schools, synagogues, et cetera, here's an address to go to.
Yes, I think that could be, I think that can be very helpful, although again, you don't want to, you want to be sure that that person's not in other words, you don't want to give the institution itself and leadership any excuse not to do the right thing, right? Everyone needs to be trained, retrained, retrained about how to respond in these situations. And so that the ombudsman should really be a sort of backup to that. But at the phase we're in now, and given what we've seen the last few years in Jewish organizations, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a watchdog in communities.
Well, Howard, it's 8:03, and I don't want to overstay our welcome. Stephen, it's a bit of a it's quite amazing to me, a testament to you. We started with 51 participants, and we have 50 now. That's amazing.
Excellent.
I interrupted you earlier, so you did want to give some sort of I think you did address this question already, but if there anything further want us to know, and this is a fairly diverse group, but it does include some educators, rabbis, organizational leaders, donors, etc. So whatever else you want to share with us, here's your opportunity for some final thoughts.
Final thoughts. It's worse than you think it is. And I am not, I am not by nature, someone who says that, but I realize that or catastrophizes, let us say. But I've now, especially over the last few months, talking with Jewish organizations, hearing disclosures in the very audiences that tell me there's not a problem. A lot of disclosures of family abuse, of intergenerational incest in Jewish families. We really need to almost force ourselves to be open to this reality, that we have an ongoing reality of pedophilia in our community. It is, as I like to say, it's sort of the constant of the equation is pedophiles. There's something very deep in the human species that some certain percent of the population in all communities are these kind of sociopathic pedophiles who will seize any opportunity to exploit children. The variable in that equation is how we respond to it. And that is very much in our power. And there's just a tremendous room for improvement. I would, an ambassador for Child USA, which put out something called the gold standard last year, which I would encourage you to have a look at the Child USA website and to recommend to organizations as a starting point. Excuse me. The gold standard it's the first evidence-based set of safeguards for youth serving organizations, meaning their social scientists reviewed thousands of cases of sexual assault of children across the Catholic Church, athletics, the Boy Scouts, and actually looked at what happened and why safeguards are in place, because believe it or not, supposedly safeguards were in place at the Boy Scouts and other institutions, why they failed. And then based on why they failed, in other words, based on reality, they constructed a new set of safeguards that covers background screening, employee training, recognizing red flags, reporting, what every institution should be doing. And they're now beginning work with insurance companies who, of course, get caught holding the bag when there are claims settled, to have insurance companies enforce these standards. So that's sort of my big picture recommendation, and what I'm advocating to Jewish institutions, that they start with the gold standard. And when it comes to parents with kids in summer camps or any youth activities, to ask the tough questions. There's, it's a parental responsibility, and it's kind of shocking to me how many parents are willing to send their kids off for 8 weeks where someone they've never met or don't know is going to be in loco parentis without asking some fundamental questions, like, how do you prevent child sex abuse, and what do you do when it's reported? That deserves a thoughtful answer, and you don't always get it. So that's a warning.
Thanks. So, there are a number of comments in the chat extolling your courage and your and the importance of your work. And I wanted to add, there was a question about where people can go. And as I mentioned earlier, Barbara had suggested an ombudsman or such, but the reality is a co-sponsor of this conversation is Shalom Bayit, which actually serves that function in the community. So, and I've seen them do this. So they are there as an advocate.
And they're also, I just want to point out, we've made huge progress since I was a kid. Okay, so today there are children's advocacy centers in 925 cities across America. So, there's at least one, if not, I'm sure many more in the Bay Area. And children's advocacy centers are essentially under one roof. All of the legal, psychotherapeutic services and law enforcement connections that are necessary if abuse is suspected. So if nothing else, people should feel prompted to and feel comfortable contacting your local children's advocacy center, which exists for exactly that purpose. I mean, they really are the community ombudsman and know how to respond in these situations. That's what they do.
Stephen, thank you for sharing your story. As was mentioned, the book is chosen, Memoir of a Stolen Boyhood. It can be purchased at Afikomen in Berkeley. I think it's also at the library if people want to borrow it. I think there was at least one comment in the chat from someone who has experienced this as well, I think from Boy Scouts. And I know that Stephen was interested in encouraging people to share their stories with him. So, so that's there. This has been recorded. Please spread the word and let folks know if they're interested. They can contact the library to and get this recording and watch it. Howard, any final words?
I just want to thank you and David. I want to thank you, Stephen. This has really been an important conversation. I want to thank everybody for being here to listen, and I'm grateful to all of you, and I'm grateful to Shalom Bayit for their partnership and for all their work. We will send an email message to everybody tomorrow with some of the links that relate to the program, and also some further resources. Again, thanks everybody for being here, and be safe.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and also for all the great questions.
Thank you, Stephen. And it's going to be on us to make sure this wasn't just a one-off conversation, but something that actually may provoke some change.
Music to my ears. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.